Today I'm going to show how to install a 6th downpipe in a 2019 or newer Hyundai Veloster N. The process for the Elantra N is very similar with a few small differences. The main difference is the 6th downpipe for the Elantra has a mounting bracket and the space that you have to work with is different. I was nervous to perform this particular installation due to the horror stories I've read online and seen on YouTube. Also, most videos don't seem to really show the entire process. This may be a longer video, but I'm trying my best to show the entire process start to finish. Also, I will share my secret on how to perform the install without breaking or damaging the studs that connect the downpipe to the turbo. Finally, I will show how to complete this install without the need of a lift since not everyone has access to one. I hope this video helps your install go smoother and alleviates the need for your vehicle to go to a shop to perform this install, which can be very costly. Just in case you do run into an issue with one or more of the studs, I would suggest having a set of ARP studs on hand just in case. These can be purchased on Amazon and returned if not used. I will have a link to all the items used for the install in the video description. To begin the installation process, you'll need to raise the car off the ground. I found a reasonable solution was a pair of Max Haul extended ramps. These ramps cost less than $150 and allowed me to raise the car twice as much as the typical 3-inch low-profile ramps. I did need to remove my wife's front splitter to be able to drive up the ramps. I found the ramps worked for my Elantra N with my Velocity splitter installed. Next, you'll need to open your hood so you can begin working on the top section of the downpipe. The items that need to be completed are the following: remove or move part of the turbo heat shielding, disconnect and remove the top O2 sensor, unhook and remove the O2 sensor wiring and brackets, and finally unscrew and remove the 4 nuts holding the downpipe to the turbo. I forgot to disconnect my negative battery terminal, but I would suggest doing so before beginning the installation process. The first item I tackled was unscrewing the top heat shield bolt. You'll need a 10mm socket for all the heat shield bolts. I was able to use a 10mm deep socket for this first bolt. You will not remove this section of the heat shield from the car. Instead, gently pry the shield back towards the engine. Next, there are 2 bolts holding the rear section of the heat shield. Remove these 2 bolts and push the panel up towards the firewall. You'll need to use a 10mm wrench or short socket to remove the top bolt. I then removed 2 of the 3 bolts holding the heat shield covering the downpipe. I used a long socket extension and a swivel joint for the front bolt and a small wrench for the lower side bolt. I saw that the piece covering the downpipe might be a bit difficult to get out, so to give myself a little more wiggle room, I removed the lower bolt holding the first heat shield covering in place. This doesn't allow you to remove the heat shield, it simply allows it to move a bit more towards the engine. I used a 10mm socket with socket extension to remove the bolt and a magnetic wand to pull the bolt up from the engine. After I had most of the heat shield taken care of, I moved over to the O2 sensor wiring. Unhook the lower O2 sensor's wiring harness. Unhook the gray wire harness. Unhook the top O2 sensor's plug. And then using a set of angled long nose pliers, pinch and remove the gray wire harness's clip that holds the wire harness to the wire mount. Then push the wire harness forward and remove it from the wire bracket. Using the same pliers, remove the lower O2 sensor's wire harness from the wire bracket. Using a 10mm socket, remove the top wire bracket. This will need to be done to remove the top O2 sensor. Remove the O2 sensor. To do so, you'll need to use a 22mm O2 removal socket. The O2 sensor is a bit tight, but not too bad. Just be careful when removing the sensor. After the sensor is loosened, you can unscrew it the rest of the way by hand. To remove the downpipe's heat shield, you'll need to remove the third bolt located on the back side of the shield. I had to use a small 10mm wrench to remove this bolt. I only needed the wrench to loosen the bolt, then I was able to unscrew it by hand the rest of the way. The last thing that we need to do before removing the downpipe bolts is to remove the lower wire bracket. This bracket is held into place by one 10mm bolt. You'll need to detach the lower O2 sensor's wire from the bracket using long nose pliers before you unscrew the bolt. So what's my secret, you may be asking? Well, the secret is to soak your nuts and to soak them a lot. You have them, I have them, we all have nuts in our cars, and they must be soaked. I began on Sunday night, spraying them once before bed. Then I sprayed the nuts about every couple of hours the following day. And finally I sprayed them one more time in the morning that I had planned the install. I would say that I sprayed them about 8 to 9 times over 3 days. This may have been overkill, but I wasn't taking any chances. What should I soak my nuts in? Well, that's a good question. I found soaking the nuts that secure the downpipe to the turbo with WD-40 penetrating spray with Easy Flex Straw is the best product to loosen the nuts without damaging the studs. I put a piece of painter's tape over the O2 sensor's hole just so that the WD-40 would not get into the downpipe. The Flex Straw was very helpful in reaching the lower back bolt that's hard to see. After I allowed the nuts to soak in WD-40 for 3 days, the moment of truth had arrived. It was time to see if I could remove them without any damage. I used a 14mm deep socket with a small extension for the first nut. To my surprise, the nut came off easily with little effort. I moved on to the next top nut. Again, the nut came off with ease. I was careful to take my time unscrewing the nuts. If you feel the nut get a little stuck, tighten the nut slightly, then go back to loosening the bolt again. Take your time and be easy. 2 more to go. I moved to the last easily accessible nut and unscrewed it. No issues again. At this point, I was feeling pretty good, but I still had one last nut, and it was the one that I was the most worried about. To break the bolt, I used a 14mm deep socket, swivel socket, short extension, and long extension. It was a little bit of a Frankenstein setup, but it worked. After the bolt was loosened, I switched to using just a 10mm deep socket and swivel joint. I had to keep my hand on the socket to ensure it stayed onto the nut. I was so happy when all of the nuts came off without any issues. My next two concerns were the 2 downpipe bracket bolts and getting the downpipe fished out of the engine bay from underneath the car on my back. Now that the top section of the downpipe removal was done, I moved underneath the car to finish the remaining steps of removing the factory downpipe. I found I needed a bit more height for the back of the car, so I positioned my floor jack on the rear passenger side of the car and raised it just a bit. I made sure not to raise the car to the point where the front passenger wheel was off the ramp. I was able to achieve 14 inches of total height between the rear floor jack and front ramps. I began by removing the center section of the exhaust. To do this, I removed the 2 19mm nuts securing the rear section of the exhaust mid-pipe to the muffler section. I would suggest using an impact wrench for removing the exhaust bolts. This will make this step much easier. Before unbolting the front 2 exhaust bolts, you'll need to remove the center brace. The brace is held into place by 4 12mm nuts. After the brace has been removed, unbolt the 2 nuts holding the front section of the mid-pipe to the downpipe using the same 19mm socket you used for the 2 rear bolts. Detach the front and rear of the mid-pipe. Finally, push the mid-pipe towards the rear of the car to remove it from the center rubber hanger. The rubber hangers holding the downpipe in place are a bit difficult to work with, so I sprayed them with Dawn soap and water. This was a huge help in getting the downpipe off the rubber hangers. I didn't have the exhaust hanger removal tool, so instead I used a long flathead screwdriver to separate the downpipe from the rubber hangers. The factory downpipe is made up of two sections. To separate the bottom section from the top section, you need to unbolt two exhaust bolts holding the two sections together. The bolts are the same 19mm bolts used on the mid-pipe exhaust section. To reach the two bolts, I had to use a 19mm deep socket attached to a swivel joint and then 3 socket extensions, 2 small extensions and 1 large extension. Due to the angle of the driver's side bolt, it was a bit trickier than on the passenger side. After the bolts have been removed, you can pull the lower downpipe section out of the car. To make removing the upper downpipe section easier, you'll want to remove the lower heat shield. The heat shield is held into place by 3 10mm nuts. I didn't do this initially, but found it was necessary when removing the downpipe. Before we remove the upper downpipe section, I would suggest removing the splash shield. This will help give better access to the downpipe's 2 mounting bolts. Also, it will help with moving the engine, which you will need to do to get the downpipe out of the engine bay. The splash shield is easy to remove. It's held into place by 7 10mm bolts and several plastic clips. Once the splash shield has been removed, you can unbolt the 2 downpipe mounting bolts. The bolts are located behind the oil pan next to the intercooler pipe. You'll need to use a 14mm socket to remove these bolts. I found they were very difficult to remove, so I grabbed my handy WD-40 penetrating spray and hit the 2 bolts. I let the bolts sit for about 15 minutes. When I went back to remove the bolts, they came off easily. I used a 14mm socket and long extension to reach the bolts. To get the downpipe out of the car, you need to be able to move the engine forward. To do this, you'll need to unbolt the lower engine mount. You'll need a 17mm socket and wrench to remove the engine mount bolt. After the nut has been removed, you may need to use a rubber mallet to knock the bolt out of the mount. With the bolt removed, you'll have enough movement in the engine to help get the downpipe out of the car. I placed a jack stand under the engine just as a safety precaution. Now we're ready to snake the downpipe out of the car. I would suggest having a friend help with this to make the job much easier. I was fortunate to have my wife helping me. She got under the car and held the downpipe while I removed the downpipe from the turbo. Be sure to remove the factory gasket as we will be replacing it with a new gasket. With my wife still holding the downpipe, I moved under the car to help move the engine forward. I grabbed the lower area of the engine and pulled it forward as much as I could. This gave my wife enough room to turn the downpipe and remove it from the car. At first, we got the O2 sensor and one of the bolts stuck when trying to rotate the downpipe. This is why having a second person pull on the engine helps a lot. I was able to give her enough room to get the O2 sensor and bolt unstuck and continue with rotating the downpipe. This would have been more of a challenge with only one person moving the engine and rotating the downpipe all at the same time by themselves. The team effort really paid off. Here's a comparison between the factory 2-piece downpipe and the Sxth 1-piece downpipe. Before we move on to installing the new downpipe into the car, we need to transfer the lower O2 sensor from the factory downpipe to the new downpipe. Using a 22mm O2 sensor socket, remove the O2 sensor from the factory downpipe and install it on the new 6th downpipe. The factory specs state the O2 sensor should be torqued to 28.9 to 36.2 pound-feet. Finally, transfer the lower exhaust gasket to the 6th downpipe. Go ahead and loosely install the supplied hardware provided by 6th. You will install a washer on each side of both bolts. Follow along with how I installed the 6th downpipe up into the engine bay. You'll begin with the O2 sensor facing the driver's side of the car. My wife was standing ready at the top of the engine to help me fish the downpipe up. This was very helpful as the downpipe is not light. Once it was close to the desired position next to the turbo, I pushed the downpipe into each of the rubber hangers. This helped to hold the downpipe in position while I went back up to install the downpipe onto the turbo. Before setting the downpipe onto the turbo, you need to install the supplied gasket onto the turbo. Make sure the gasket is positioned correctly. The yellow dot should be located at the bottom of the turbo. After the gasket has been installed, set the downpipe onto the turbo studs. Since I didn't damage any of the studs, I did not install a new set of studs onto the turbo. Begin installing the supplied nuts from 6th. The ones they provided required a 12-point 12mm socket. The first 3 nuts were easy to reach. The 4th rear bolt was just as tricky to tighten as it was to remove. I had to use a swivel joint again to tighten it down. After the bolts have been tightened, you need to torque each nut to 36.2 to 39.7 foot-pounds. I chose to split the difference and torque the nuts to 38 foot-pounds. The lower rear nut was difficult to torque using a swivel joint. With the top of the downpipe attached, I move back under the car to reattach the exhaust midpipe. Slide the pipe back onto the center rubber hanger. Tighten the two 19mm rear bolts that attach the midpipe to the muffler. Attach the front of the midpipe to the new downpipe. Use a 19mm socket and wrench to tighten the new bolts. The Sxth Downpipe does not have a bracket that needs to be bolted to the factory downpipe support.
Yes. Weird fucking delay right here. Yes, sir.
Reattach the lower heat shield using the three 10mm nuts. Next, reattach the middle underbody brace using the four 12mm nuts. Reinstall the 17mm bolt and nut for the lower engine mount. You'll need a little help aligning the engine. The bolt will need to be torqued to 75 foot-pounds. Finally, reinstall the splash shield. Once done, the part of the installation underneath the car is finished. You can move back up to the top of the engine. At the top of the engine, reinstall the lower wire bracket with its 10mm bolt. Pull the lower O2 sensor wire harness up. Reinstall the downpipe's heat shield. Screw in the front and side 10mm bolt. I decided to leave out the rear 10mm bolt. Pull down and reinstall the rear turbo heat shield. Screw in its two 10mm bolts that hold it in place. Finally, fold over the front heat shield and screw in its top and front 10mm bolts. With the heat shield install complete, go ahead and reinstall the O2 sensor. The factory torque spec for the O2 sensor is 28.9 to 36.2 foot-pounds. Install the top wire bracket with its 10mm bolt. Reattach the O2 sensor's wire and push the wire harness clips back into the brackets. After all the wires have been reattached, the installation is complete. Here are two sound clips showing how the car sounded after the install. The first clip is with the car in normal mode. The second clip is with the car in N mode. The car is louder than normal due to the car having a resonator delete. If you want the car to have a lot of pops and bangs, a downpipe and resonator delete will definitely give you a lot of pops and bangs. It sounds like your car is firing like a gun. It sounds crazy. This install took me and my wife a total of 5 hours to complete from start to finish. The key was letting the downpipe to turbo nuts soak in WD-40 penetrating spray for over a day. This helped immensely. Also, having a second person to help made the install much easier. It's great having a wife that loves working on cars as much as I do. Finally, this is an install that can definitely be done without needing a lift. I had the car 14 inches off the ground with the ramps and floor jacks. This was not as scary of an install as it's been made out to be. Maybe I just got lucky, but the install went better than expected. I hope this video helps you install your new downpipe. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more content.